we could start off being very broad and just talking about extending lifespan and improving late life health. Really the goal for the field is to improve late life health. There is an exponential increase in diseases when we become older. And, by addressing the underlying mechanisms that drive aging, we're hoping to reduce the incidence of those diseases. The ultimate goal is improved quality of life when we're older. This is likely to lead to overall extensions in lifespan, which would be great. But as I say, the main goal is to extend overall lifespan. The field has sort of been around for 80 or so years, and it started off with this basic finding that if you almost near starve an animal, a rat, it lives longer. And so that was, really the basic finding for a long time, probably until the late 90s, when the first gene mutation that resulted in an increased lifespan was discovered. And it was discovered in a little worm called Caenorhabditis elegans, C. elegans. It's a little animal that we study in the lab. And since then, there's been explosion in the number of drugs and genes that have been identified that could potentially extend healthy lifespan. Some of those drugs are clinically available. We don't know whether they improve health span and overall lifespan in humans, but they certainly do in these lab animals.
So you talk to me a lot about, the basics that you as a scientist will do, that David Sinclair will do, that the people that you work with in your laboratory have adopted as a base level. And that was fasting, that was exercise, that was sleep, and then overlaying of that, you're taking some supplements, so NAD being one of them. Can you explain to me what is the difference between NAD and NR? We get that question a lot.
Yeah, so look, the first thing is that, I have to caution with supplements. I don't advocate anyone to go out and try these supplements. They are a fairly unregulated area. We're going to a lot of efforts to run proper clinical trials so we know whether they work. But in the meantime, the question about the difference between NR and NAD. So NR stands for nicotinamide riboside. Now, NAD is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. So that latter molecule, NAD, it's quite a big molecule, and it doesn't get into cells on its own. So, you can take NAD as a pill, or it's now quite common for people to take it as an IV infusion, but it just doesn't get into cells. So NAD itself is kind of useless. Now, nicotinamide riboside can get into cells, and so that's great. So aside from being able to get into, it's a more advanced intermediate in NAD synthesis. So there's a long pathway to get all the way from a starting molecule through to NAD. And so NR is, further along that pathway. And so that's one of the advantages of taking of nicotinamide riboside, that it's further along and that it can get into cells. So it still has to be converted into NAD, but that's the theory behind nicotinamide riboside. It has been approved for use as a supplement in the United States. This is what we call GRAS status, generally recognized as safe. So it has undergone some toxicity studies, although it's not to the same level of rigor that you would expect from a drug.
And that was my next question. What is the difference between, a supplement and a drug? Because a lot of the claims can be similar. And I guess that a lot of the science starts in the supplementation area or natural, ingredients, and then they're studied and they're modified and it becomes a drug. What's the difference?
Yeah, so the difference between supplements and drugs is down to safety, efficacy, and regulation. So, the regulation for drugs is extremely intense. For good reason. These are medicines that are being prescribed by doctors. And if a doctor gives you something, you expect it to be safe and to actually does what it's supposed to work. For supplements, the bar is a lot lower. Supplements aren't actually allowed to say that they treat a disease. You will see that on many supplement bottles, the wording is quite vague. It doesn't actually talk about improving any particular state or any physiological change. For good reason, that there just isn't the clinical data to show that that's the case. If there is a clinical body of evidence showing that a supplement can do all of these things, then it can just be registered as a medicine. And that certainly was the case, for example, with some supplement-like products. So for example, nicotinic acid or niacin is a naturally occurring supplement, a naturally occurring molecule. It's present in foods, it's fortified into breads. And when used at very high doses, it can treat some aspects of cardiovascular disease. And so this was actually approved by the FDA, and it's now a treatment for cardiovascular disease as a medicine, a true drug, something that doctors prescribe, not a supplement which has a lot lower threshold for evidence. So supplements don't have to go through what we call a phase 1 clinical trial, which is where we show in humans through very rigorous studies that it's safe, and you don't have to prove that it actually treats a disease. In return, supplements tend not to be prescribed by doctors, and they are not allowed to advertise any claims to efficacy, being able to treat any disease state. So there's a big difference in the regulation between the two.
And another thing that we discussed when we were on the laboratory tour, which I found quite fascinating, is you know, cancer is obviously a disease that can hit at any age, but you know, is more likely as part of an aging process. But you were sharing with us that chemotherapy, whilst it can get rid of the cancer, the other knock-on effects to aging-related diseases and is quite significant. And so some of the work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, can really benefit cancer survivors.
Yeah, that's a really important topic for the lab at the moment, one of our main research areas. So chemotherapy drugs, you know, the most successful chemotherapy drugs are still the drugs that we had from decades ago. There have been some substantial advances in oncology, so in particular immuno-oncology, so these immune checkpoint inhibitors that control the response of the immune system to cancer. But prior to that, still the best drugs we have are really old drugs, and these older drugs are fairly non-specific. So these are what we call cytotoxic drugs. They're essentially poisons that tend to kill faster growing cells at a fast, more than non-growing cells, but that's not that specific a mechanism. So as we all know, chemotherapy causes this range of side effects in cancer patients, and they're absolutely devastating during cancer treatment. But even following cancer treatment, the impacts of chemotherapy treatment are long lasting. So one of the greatest impacts in terms of healthy years lost is, of course, childhood cancer, where it's younger kids being treated with chemotherapy. They have longer left to live, and those long-term impacts of chemotherapy become more apparent. So just to put it in perspective, 96% of childhood cancer survivors have at least one chronic health condition by the age of 45. Now, the
and that's as a direct result of not the cancer, but the chemotherapy.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. And so, they're seeing diseases like type 2 diabetes, neurocognitive diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancers unrelated to the initial cancer. So these are all a result of, as a spectrum of diseases, it resemble accelerated aging. So preventing the damage that occurs as a result of chemotherapy treatment is really important. And so that's what we're, one of the topics we're really keen on pursuing in the lab. How can we ameliorate the impacts of chemotherapy in cancer patients, not just during their treatment, but for their longer term health, so that they don't have this accelerated aging condition.
And that's not of interest to the government? I mean, gosh, if you look at
absolutely, that is, but I don't think recognizing it as aging research has gained that much traction. There is a case to be made to funding agencies that if you are treating the symptoms of, or if you are improving the health span of cancer survivors, that is a funding priority. That's recognized by cancer funding agencies that they need to take care of these patients after the cancer treatment is finished. The same interventions, the same non-pharmaceutical interventions that are associated with healthy aging are also associated with better cancer outcomes. So, in recent years, there's been this strong push towards exercise in cancer patients, which is really effective.
Sorry, I missed that. What's been the push towards what?
Exercise in cancer
patients. Exercise. Oh, yeah, of course. Yes.
Therapy treatment. Which is excellent. So, the benefits of exercise to these patients, aside from, reducing the impacts of their chemotherapy, it actually makes chemotherapy more effective. These patients have far better outcomes. And that's something that's being rolled out, around the country, increasingly used, exercise in cancer patients.
And in terms of, speaking of collaborations and working together, do you feel that, as a scientist, how far away are we from some definitive drugs or definitive protocols that we can use in human trials? Because I guess that's the billion-dollar question that the likes of Jeff Bezos and, Elon Musk and, the new billionaire investors who are really committed to this anti-aging technology and biotech. How far away are we?
So I'll answer that in a couple of ways. The first, the one that I've, in shorter form interviews is how many years are we away from having this approved to treat as aging in humans? And man, I've seen that movie before and I'm not giving an answer. But what I will say...
How do I get to be an extra in that movie? Sign me up.
What I will say is that most of these therapies are being developed for other diseases in the meantime. The idea is that a drug that could, in the distance, be used to treat aging, in the meantime, a sort of lower hanging fruit may be a disease like cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes or infertility or something like this. And so that's really where all the efforts are at. It's largely for pragmatic reasons. We would never have enough money to run the trial of a brand new drug in humans to see if it extended overall lifespan. That trial would just be too long and expensive. But in the meantime, if we're right about this idea of drugs that could treat this holistic process of aging, we should be able to treat some very specific disease indications, which we know are a big problem now and aren't controversial whatsoever. And so that's where the field is at the moment. So, for example, drugs that are under investigation for increasing energy expenditure, which could eventually be used to extend overall or treat age-related diseases. If you have a drug that increases energy expenditure in the meantime, you could use it to treat metabolic diseases, fatty liver disease, obesity, diabetes, and so on. If you have a drug that improves autophagy, which is the recycling of damaged components of the cell, although that could be used for aging in itself, there are, in the meantime, plenty of diseases where autophagy can be defective. For example, some of these orphan diseases where damaged proteins build up in certain tissues, for example, the eye, which you could address in the meantime. So that's a much lower hanging fruit. And the advantage of going after that lower hanging fruit is that it gets you into the clinic and allows you to prove on a larger scale that these compounds are safe after a long period of time in humans.